In this lesson, we will be talking about selecting color, gradients, and blurs. When creating paths and shapes in Inkscape, they will have a fill and stroke color automatically assigned to them. So let's see how we can change that. We will start by drawing a random shape. So let's take our square tool here and draw out a shape. The shape will have a default fill color, and you can see the color in the top right corner up here. Under fill, you can see the color that is assigned to the shape. If you double click on this section here, it will open the preferences. And here you can choose the style of the new object. So if you want to use the last used style, which is what is selected currently, or this tool's own style. But for now, we will leave it at last used style and we can close the dialog. To choose a fill color, you can choose them from all of these swatches that we have here below. We have a set of colors in this section, but if we click on these arrows right next to all the swatches, you will see that we get different styles of swatches. So these ones, for example, vary from shades of yellow to shades of green. And then if we click down again, we get shades of aqua to shades of blue. Click down again, we get shades of bluey purple to shades of pink. And so on. By clicking, we can get different styles of shades. We can also select this icon here. And here we are able to choose all different styles of palettes. We can get shades of blue. We can choose different ones. This is bootstrap. We can choose another style like so. So we really have an infinite amount of palettes and swatches that we can choose from. But let's go back to the automatic one, which was Inkscape default. And to choose the fill color, all you need to do is select the colors that are here. So just by left clicking on the colors, you can choose which shade you want to apply as a fill. You can also change the fill color in the fill and stroke dialog window. We can open that by selecting the shortcut on our keyboard, Shift, Control, and the letter F. This will open our fill and stroke dialog, where we have this color wheel where we are able to change the fill color, as mentioned previously, like so. You can change the hue and also the tone, so if you want it darker, brighter, or lighter. So on this color wheel, we can really choose whatever type of shade that we prefer. We also have options up here that interact with the type of fill. We can choose no fill. So to have an empty shape, we can choose fill and then have a full shape. We can choose linear gradient, which we will be seeing more in detail further on. We can choose radial gradient, mesh gradient, pattern, swatch, and unset paint. But let's go back to our flat color option, as that is what we will be working with. At the bottom left of the screen, you can also see the fill. Here, right next to fill, we can see the color that is chosen for the fill of the object. If you right click on the fill, you get a menu of options, like for example, Edit Fill will open the fill and stroke dialog that we have open here on the right. Invert will change the color to the opposite of it. So let's click that and see. So the opposite of that shade of green will give us this shade of purple. So that's very interesting. Let's right click again on the fill and get our menu of options back. We can also choose to make it white, black. We can copy the color, paste the color. We can swap the fill and stroke. We can make the fill opaque, unset the fill, and remove the fill. But let's invert it again to get our shade of green back and move on. Another way of changing color is by selecting the shape with our selector tool. So let's select it. Go down on the bottom left corner on top of fill, click, and start dragging. This will change the hue value like so by dragging towards the left or the right, up and down. This will change the value of our color. And you can also see that in our fill and stroke dialog here, how it changes when we click and start dragging. Notice how the color wheel is moving automatically as we are moving our mouse. Once you choose the new hue, you can release, obviously. Then you can go back to the bottom left on the fill option here, select the Control key, and then click and drag again. This will change the lightness, so it will make it brighter, lighter, or darker just by dragging like so. And again, you can see it in the color wheel here in our fill and stroke dialog. So by moving our mouse, we can change the lightness of our hue. So let's just select a brightness that we like and release. If we do the same process but by clicking Shift, so let's select Shift, select our fill and stroke, and then start dragging, this will change the saturation. So notice how it goes from a very bright yellow, and if we drag down, it reaches shades of gray. So this is what's changing the saturation. It makes it very, very gray, or the brightest that it can be, like so. And finally, the same process, if we select Alt instead, so let's select Alt on our keyboard, click and start dragging. This will change the alpha value, which will affect the transparency of our color. So notice as I drag more to the left, it is nice and saturated, but if I drag more to the right, it becomes more pale. This is because it is becoming more transparent. And you can notice this also on the alpha channel here below. Always in our fill and stroke dialog, this is showing how transparent or how opaque our color is. So notice how as I'm moving my mouse to the left and to the right, this value is also moving inside of this option here, which affects, as I mentioned, the transparency. But let's keep it fully opaque and release. And obviously, all of these things that we have just done with our keyboard shortcuts, we can also do in the fill and stroke dialog by moving our options here. So hue, saturation, lightness, and alpha. Here we can change the hue that we prefer. Here we can affect the saturation. Here we can affect the lightness. And here we can affect the transparency or alpha. You can also change the values up here. So again, this is what we have just seen. So hue, saturation, light, and alpha. You could also choose RGB, for example, so red, green, and blue, and you can alter those values, or even CMYK. But if you want to work with CMYK, just be aware that since you're working with an SVG software, which doesn't support CMYK the same as other graphic files format do, just keep that in mind as the colors will be affected differently. So I would suggest to stay in the RGB channels or HSL. Along with the fill, we can also affect the stroke of our shape. So we can see it here in the fill and stroke panel by clicking the stroke paint option. Here we can also choose the color of our stroke. We can change the hue like so. And in these options here, again, we can change the hue here. We can change the saturation like so. We can change the lightness and also the transparency by dragging these here. So the exact same as with the fill, but in this case, we are affecting only the stroke of our shape. We also have the same options here above. We can choose no paint in the stroke. We can choose flat color, linear gradient, radial gradient, mesh gradient, pattern, swatch, and unset paint. You can also see the stroke color in the bottom left corner. So here, right underneath fill, we have also the stroke color. And if we right click it, we will get again a options menu, so we can edit the stroke, and that will open up this dialog that we already have open here on the right. We can select last set color, last selected color. We can invert again, which will choose the opposite color on the color wheel. Let's open up our menu again. We can choose white, black. We can copy and paste the color. We can swap the fill-in stroke. We can make the stroke opaque, unset stroke, and remove stroke. But let's go ahead and invert it again and move on. And lastly, to choose the color of the stroke, which is the most important part, we can still use all of the swatches that we have here below that we have used to choose the fill color. But in this case, to set the color for stroke fill, all we need to do is select Shift and then click on the color, and that will change the stroke. So if we normal click, we will change the fill color, and then if we select Shift and click, that will change the stroke color. Next, we will be talking about gradients. To talk about gradients, I have prepared this little scene where we can experiment on and see how the gradients work and how they look. So let's start off by adding a gradient here to the sky. So on the shape that is on the bottom, so the blue circle which represents the sky, I will add a gradient. I will do that by selecting the gradient tool in our toolbar with the shortcut G. So it is this tool that we have here, create and edit gradients. And I can simply start clicking where I want it to start, and then I can start dragging without releasing and select where I want my gradient to end. So let's select the bottom of the circle, and then I can release. The 2 points that make where you started and released are called stops. You can select them and drag them, for example, like so, to change the gradient direction. And you can also change the color or the opacity of each stop if desired. With a stop selected, you can choose any of the swatches below. So we can choose a darker blue, for example, like so. And we can also go in our fill and stroke dialog and use the color controls here to adjust the color. So we can also change it or just adjust it, adjust the lightness, the saturation, and so on. Let's also change the color of the stop at the bottom. So this one that we have selected now. And let's choose an orangey color to make it look like a sunset, like so. If you want more control over the colors, you can also add an extra stop just by double clicking anywhere along the gradient with the gradient tool selected. So like I just did now. And then you can move this stop too, move it wherever you want, like so. Change its color, so we can change this color also, and also change the opacity and move it wherever we want, like this, for example. The offset value in the tool controls above tells you exactly where the stop is. So if I select a stop, it will tell you exactly the value of where the stop is. So you can move the stop to a precise location by changing this value. So I can change the value here, for example, and change it completely, or I can bring it back, so like so, and bring it back to where it was. If you want to delete the stop, all you need to do is select it and then press the delete key on your keyboard. Notice up here in the tool controls that there's this menu, stops, that if you open it up, it shows all the different stops that you have. This is very useful if you are working on a very complicated gradient with a lot of different stops. This is very useful to keep track of all of them and also to see their type of opacity. And you can click them from here to see which one is which, and that way you don't ever need to be confused about where the stops are and how many there are. There's also an option to invert a gradient. So this one here, if I select this, it reverses the direction of the gradient, as you may notice. So from a sunset, now this looks more like a sunrise. And we can select it again and it will invert it again. If you want to change the style of the gradient from linear to radial, for example, you can do that in the fill dialog. You can change the gradient from linear to radial, for example, like so. But keep in mind that you can only do it from the fill dialog here. You cannot do it from the tool controls above. These only work when you are creating a new gradient, so they don't work for changing a current gradient that you're working on. But here in the fill and stroke dialog, you can select whichever style of gradient you want and it will change the one that you are currently working on. And here, for example, in the radial gradient, notice that there are 3 stops that you can use to change the shape. You have 1 square and 2 round. The color of the 2 round is linked, so if you change one of them, the other one will change too automatically, but you can move them independently. So you could make the gradient elliptical, for example, by moving one of the 2 stops, like so and like so. So if you move one handle, the other one won't move. But if you change the color on one stop, so make it more pink, for example, it will automatically change the color in the other stop too. If you add or remove stops, the changes will appear on both paths, on both gradient paths. So if we add another stop here, it will also appear on this side. And if we select a stop and delete it, it will also be deleted on the other gradient path. You can also add the gradient that you have created to other shapes. So if, for example, I were to create a square here in the fill and stroke dialog, if I select in the fill options, I select linear gradient, I can open this little options menu here, gradient, and we will find the gradient that we have created previously. So notice that the same one that is created here will also appear in this square. But this won't copy any changes that you've made with the stops, for example. So if you have added stops or made them more opaque or less opaque in one style of gradient, that won't copy automatically to the new one. But gradients can be linked if you want. So if you select the gradient tool in our toolbars here, and then select the lock in the tool controls that we can find up here, link gradients to change all related gradients. So let's select that. And then let's change the color in one of these stops here. So let's make it red, for example. So now the color that I have changed here will also automatically change the color in our previous gradient. And then if we select our lock again and we select this gradient, for example, and now I change this to a different color again, it won't automatically change. Notice now I've made it green. It won't automatically change in this gradient also. The last option we have is to move gradients along with the object we move or not. So with the selector tool selected here, we can see there are 4 options in the tool controls above, these ones here. We saw these in the previous lesson, and we also started talking about this third option here, move gradients in fill or stroke along with the shapes. Move gradients in fill or stroke along with the objects. This third one is to move the gradients with the shape. So with it selected, if I change the shape of this object, the gradient will stay in the same place, like so. But with it deselected now, if I move the shape, the gradient doesn't move along with the shape itself. It will change based on where the shape is. So it's like the gradient will stay still, and if I move the shape, then we will only see part of the gradient. But if I select it again, now the gradient moves along with the shape. So that is a very interesting option to keep in mind. The last thing we will be talking about in this lesson is how to blur. So there are different ways that we can blur an image and an object. Let's start off by seeing how we can blur, for example, a shape. By selecting it, you will see in the fill-in stroke dialog that we have an option here below that is blur and opacity. So blur will literally, if we click and drag, it will literally go and blur an object. So very simply, all we need to do is drag and we can make the blur very, very accentuated or very, very discreet. And this way you could really make it look like an object is out of focus, for example. So by blurring it ever so slightly, it can look like that object in the background is more out of focus than the others. Another option that we have is using the tweak tool in the toolbar. The tweak tool is this tool that we find here that's shaped like a wave. Tweak objects by sculpting or painting. So we can select it and select this option here, blur selected objects more with shift blur less. So we can select this and then pass it over an object. But let's Control Z and we can bring down this here to 15, for example, and then blur it more delicately. Like so, just by giving one click, it will blur the object very so slightly, like so. And then as it says up here, if we select shift, we can blur less and bring the blur back to the original. But let's give it a little bit of a blur, like so. So notice how now it looks like the mountain as per se in the foreground is more in focus and the mountains in the background are out of focus. We could even do it the opposite way. So we can Control Z and now let's select the mountain in the foreground. Let's select our tweak tool. Make sure our blur tool is selected and we can blur the mountain in the foreground. Then we can select this mountain and do the same thing. Let's select our tweak tool and click, click. And now it looks like the mountain in the background is more in focus and the mountains in the foreground are blurred and out of focus. So that is how using the blur tool can be very effective and useful. Now that we have seen how to select colors, how to create different styles of gradients, and how to create blurs, we can end the lesson here. If you have enjoyed this lesson, make sure to leave a like. If you have any questions or suggestions, you can leave a comment in the comment box below. And if you want to give our channel some support, you can subscribe and stay updated on all our new courses. Thanks for following along. I will see you in the next video.